Goeiedag, good day, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world.
I've been looking around for salvation. I've been looking around for the truth. All around me I see frustration, and I looked all over till I found you. I sit and listen to your stories, and you're telling me, please don't worry. There's a lot in this world you should know, and loving life is where you should go. If you're looking for somewhere to go, if you're looking for someone to know, if you're looking for someone to guide you, then loving life will guide you.
Goeienaand, good evening, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world, and welcome to tonight's live stream. And of course, a special shout out to the Loving Life family. Talking about family, Marlena is still not out of the woods yet. Spoke to her a few minutes ago, and she still has a persistent, nagging cough as she battles pneumonia. Please keep her in your prayers. We now have 15 people registered on the upcoming Lions Springbok rugby competition on Super Brew on our main lovinglifetv.com platform. To participate, simply register on lovinglifetv.com and then click on Super Brew at the top of the page. Read about the competition, then take the link to join the fun. The male and female winners at the end of the challenge each get a great food hamper delivered directly to your door, and there's absolutely no cost in participating. Talking about lovinglifetv.com, our news video platform independent of YouTube, I'm delighted to say that the registrations are exploding. We have had 1,000 new subscribers join us in the last few days alone. Please remember to subscribe to Loving Life on YouTube and to register on lovinglifetv.com, the platform we are transitioning to. Tonight, we're going to be talking to Mark Oppenheimer, who is counsel for AfriForum, about how the constitutional rights and freedoms of South Africans are being trampled on by this corrupt ANC government through changes to the proposed Equality Act. The deadline for submissions about this is the 30th of June 2021, so that's only, 10 days away. The proposed amendment constitutes a dangerous departure from the current Act and would be unconstitutional, violations of the rights to freedom of expression, religion, belief, and opinion. I'll get Mark on so that we can discuss just how dangerous and intrusive this act is to the lives of all South Africans and businesses. Here we go. Hi, Mark.
Hi, good to see you.
Good to see you, buddy. Good to see you. Right. let's get right into this, shall we? Because it's a very, very important subject, and you are the Council for AfriForum, and you've had significant successes against the ANC government in the past. So hopefully you're going to have the same happen here. Um, do we first? I do need to ask you this question: do we know who's behind the drawing up of the Equality Act? And I'll tell you why I ask this, because representatives of George Soros's Open Society Foundation are directly involved in formulating the Expropriation Without Compensation Bill and the new proposed gun legislation restricting licenses and excluding self-defense as a reason for owning a gun in South Africa. So do you know who's behind this bill or act?
Well, we know that it comes through the Minister of Justice. I suppose if you take the view that there could be other parties that have done some lobbying, that would come out because there's a submission process. So, for example, I'm putting forth a submission on the bill on behalf of AfriForum, but you might find that if there are those that are in favor of the legislation, that would come out through looking at the other submissions.
Right, so we don't actually know if there's a third party involved in formulating the act.
Not at this stage.
Right, okay. Well, let's look at the act. First, please tell us, we've got well over 200 people watching at the moment, and it's still very early days, but first tell us what the implication of redefining the terms equality and discrimination are in the Equality Act.
Yes, so those terms are used throughout the legislation, and just to give you an idea of what the act is about, it's the act that's used to counteract hate speech and unfair discrimination, and takes this view that we should be promoting equality as a society. Now, those words on their own have a particular ordinary meaning, right? So if you ask most people, is hate speech a good thing? They say, no, hate speech is bad. Is discrimination good? No, discrimination is bad. Equality, it's great. But once you start to shift the meaning of those terms, you can do something quite pernicious. And this is what we find with this amendment. So one of the things that ordinarily is the case with an act of discrimination is that we think it has to be done intentionally. And what this amendment does is to say it's intentional or not intentional, direct or indirect. So it also would add in additional things like causing someone prejudice or undermining their dignity. And traditionally, this Equality Act is supposed to be concerned with protecting certain vulnerable groups. So let's say race, sex, gender, sexual orientation, those things. The amendment says, well, it doesn't even have to be particularly located in one of those grounds. It doesn't have to be the sole or the dominant reason. Now, we contrast this with how our law ordinarily operates. We take this view that fault is a vital requirement of holding someone accountable for their actions. So, if you do something unintentionally, we don't throw you in jail for it. We don't hold you liable in terms of civil actions. So it's quite a radical departure. And just to kind of give you a sense of what would that mean on a practical level. So during apartheid, there was strict liability for the press on defamation. So if the press published something without the intent to defame, they could be held liable. So that was a very useful means for the apartheid government to kind of keep a stranglehold on the press. Right. And in the new democratic dispensation, this was rejected. The Supreme Court of Appeal said, look, the value of free speech means that you can't do that to the press. They've got to be unencumbered, and you have to have a fault requirement. And what this does really is return us back to those sort of dark days of apartheid, because discrimination is so broadly defined that it's any act or omission. So it's not just physical things you do, it's very much words that you say. So this will have big repercussions for press freedom.
Right. Well, look, I just want to add to that, because you touched on something that to me is very important. Is the bill a sneaky extension of the inequitable application of crimen injuria, which is flung around in affidavits to compromise the judgment in criminal cases in South Africa? And we've seen that when it comes to farm attacks and farm murders and stuff like that, that all of a sudden the assailant or the accused says, oh no, that farmer actually used the K word, and crimen injuria comes up. So it's used like a tool. Is this like an extension of that?
Look, I think they're related issues in the sense that South African law is quite complicated because you've got a number of things that regulate speech. So as you mentioned, we have this thing of crimen injuria. Now, crimen injuria requires an intent, so you've got to have the intention to undermine someone's dignity in a very serious way. Now, what you might think is that what this does is it removes the intent requirement, and so you could have a kind of flood of litigation at the moment. To hold someone liable for crimen injuria is quite difficult. There are a few prominent cases, that have happened in recent years in South Africa. This would make it much easier. What further complicates things is that the Equality Act isn't a criminal statute. It's a sort of somewhere in between a civil and a criminal, because you can be hounded by the state under it, but you can't serve jail time, but you can pay a fine, and those fines could be quite hefty. So it does create this additional liability. Look, the other thing you've got to bear in mind with these things is that the way the laws are drafted is that they're racially neutral. So, if you abuse someone under crimen injuria, it doesn't matter if the target is black or white. You still have an equal application of the law, and the same applies with the reading of the law under the Equality Act. However, there's of course a concern that your prosecuting authorities don't use it in an equal manner, so that they target people of particular racial groups or people who are accused of slandering, particular racial groups. So there is that sense in which you could have a discriminatory use of a law which on its face is neutral.
Right. Now, look, you touched again on something that I need to raise, and that is, I take the example, and this was a high-profile case at the time, that Springbok rugby player, even the fellow I'm talking about, I think he's a lock, and he went before the South African Human Rights Commission because apparently he offended some people in Cape Town. And if you look at other Human Rights Commission, I'm talking about the South African Human Rights Commission rulings, the way they treated Malema when he said kill the boer, kill the farmer, but that was creative speech, so that was okay. But then other people get hammered if they're the wrong skin color in that same South African Human Rights Commission. When you've got that happening in the justice system in South Africa, this new Equality Act, isn't it going to just make justice in South Africa just that more inequitable?
Yeah, there's that concern. So one of the things that's interesting about the equality legislation is that it can be brought by organizations like the Human Rights Commission, but it can also be brought by private organizations. So, for example, some civil society organizations like AfriForum have laid complaints against people for genuine acts of hate speech. So, it can be used against, some of the people that deserve to be censured, as you point out, someone like Julius Malema. There, of course, is this concern that there's an emerging double standard. To give you an idea, the Human Rights Commission made that quite obvious. So when they found that Malema's comments didn't amount to hate speech, part of the reason for that was they said, well, Malema is black and the targets of the speech are white, therefore it's justifiable speech. And that decision, by the way, is on review at the moment before the High Court. So yeah, there are moves to try and recognize that non-racialism is an important value, that equality before the law is an important value, and that if the NPA or the Human Rights Commission don't take those things seriously, well, they must be challenged.
Right. Well, I find it interesting because I hear so many cases on social media where people of African origin say we cannot be racist. We can say what we like. We can call you a mlungu. We can call you whatever word we want, and it doesn't matter. But if you're white, then it does matter. That doesn't sound fair.
So the origin of that sort of idea kind of stems from the States under that critical racial theory idea. And so there the claim is that, racism is prejudice plus power. So it's not merely saying hateful things about a particular racial group or discriminating against them through your actions. It's about having the ability to do something about it. And you might think in the States, African Americans are an ethnic minority, that they have less institutional power than white Americans. But let's think about that in South Africa. So every single member of cabinet is black. The head of the army is black. The head of the police is black. The head of every single court, barring the Specialist Competition Appeal Court, is black. Most members of the military and of the police are black. So the claim that you don't have institutional power in South Africa just strikes me as absolutely and utterly bizarre. So to say that black people can't be racist just seems absolutely false, even if you bought into the critical race theory sort of double standards approach.
Right. Now, the bill's definition of discrimination will do away with the requirement of intent, which I think you just touched on, which will create a new statutory delict based on strict liability. Can you explain to us how that works?
Yes. So, as I say, if you think about how, a delict is kind of like a civil wrong, okay? And we have a number of elements that have to be present in a delict. So there has to be something that you have done or something that you've failed to do. It's caused a harm to someone else, and you've done it with a certain mental state. So you either did it intentionally or you did it negligently. And so if you think about murder is the intentional and wrongful killing of a human being. Culpable homicide is when you kill a human being through your negligence. So you can imagine someone who's speeding on the road and hits a pedestrian. They were driving in a negligent manner. They could have taken steps to prevent that from occurring, so they're liable. But strict liability means the question is, did the thing you do cause a harm, regardless of your intentional states? And that's we basically don't do in our law. We think that intentions matter, and that strict liability is only present under a very, very small set of circumstances, and often for quite minor things. So, for example, if you're speeding, the question is, did you break the speed limit? Not did you intend to break the speed limit. But we're talking about a kind of minor regulatory offense. Here we're talking about something that could lead to your public shaming, because you could be held liable under the Equality Act, hauled before an equality court, go through all the legal costs associated with that, and be held liable and be made to pay some kind of fine, all in a situation where you had no intent. This is coupled with some other things that are brought into the Act, which is what we call vicarious liability. Vicarious liability is you sort of find in a situation where you someone who works for you performs a delict, and when they do it while under your employ, and you can be held liable as the employer. And so here you could have a situation where, let's say, one of your employees commits an act of hate speech, and you are then held liable for it. And that's quite strange, because you had no intent whatsoever to commit an act of hate speech. You didn't perform the action yourself. Your employee did it, but you're the one who's held liable. And so you might find that for companies, for example, this will be used as a tool to hold them liable because they've got deeper pockets. And so that'll obviously have all these kinds of secondary order effects, lots of chilling on speech, that companies will start to get very, very concerned about the things that their employees do. But bear in mind, the employees themselves might not be able to regulate their conduct, because if someone feels prejudiced by something they said or did, even if there was no negative intent, an action can be raised. So very, very hard to kind of conform your conduct with the law, which is something that we ordinarily think is an important part of the rule of law, that you know what the rule is and you can do something to not be in breach of it.
Right. So hypothetically speaking, let's say in Harry Smith there are two trucking companies, and they're very, very competitive. The one trucking company could actually set the other trucking company up by getting a friend to actually join the other trucking company, break this law, cause a whole lot of shit for the owner of that trucking company, who would then be named and shamed in the mainstream media. which means that the other trucking company, which actually caused the issue in the first place, would basically take all the business. I mean, these are just one of the dangers of this whole thing, isn't it?
Yeah, so you definitely would have those sorts of concerns. I mean, it wouldn't even have to be as devious as the way you've set it up, like setting up a secret plant, because really all you need to do would be to take offense at something that a business did or one of the employees did and lay a complaint to then hold the business liable. So to give you a kind of interesting case, and I think it's one of the reasons why we've seen this amendment, you remember the Tresemme clicks kind
Yes.
of
Yes.
debacle. So
And Malema.
think about how this thing goes. So basically, you have Click sells a product called Tresemme, okay, on their shelves, and they have an external ad agency that produces ads for them. The person producing the ads sort of describes the kinds of types of hair that you find that different products deal with. So if you have fine hair, it's thin hair. If you have greasy hair or damaged hair, from heat or whatever it is, normal hair, which is not seen as a good thing in the industry. You have different kinds of products of shampoo for it. And then what's done is that you have different races that are used for the different images. And I think for fine and normal, they had 2 white women, and for damaged and dry, they had 2 black women. And the EFF are very upset about this, and they march on Clicks and threaten to close down their stores. Now, what this could do is clearly there was no intent. No one intended on doing anything racist with that. So the person who produced the ad, is just it's probably these things are dealt with in an assembly line process as well. So you've got multiple actors doing a thing. Someone gets upset about it, claims that it has a racist effect. Now what you could do is you could hold the ad agency liable, you could hold Clicks liable, you could hold Tresemme liable.
Wow.
And so, that's obviously a concern because there was no intent, but someone says, but I felt prejudiced by your ad. Now, I think you could probably play this game with anything that you like. So, I think if you are creative enough about how you feel offended by things, just go through any magazine or any book or, any statements made by whichever newspaper you like. You will find something in there that if you read with a perverted mind will fit the definitions in this act. And you're just going to have, courts being inundated with these spurious actions. I mean, the guys who do the best out of this are guys like me, of course, right? If you're a lawyer who specializes in equality court work, you're going to be, making lots of money. But it's not good for our society. It's not good for the legal system, and it's not good for trust. Because you kind of if you have people fighting each other in courts very publicly and these financial incentives to do it, you can have a lot of sort of tearing at the fabric of society. That's not a good thing for our reconciliatory project, which is one of the reasons why the Equality Act is there, by the way, which is sort of about reconciliation. And the equality courts are a funny thing. So there was some sense in which they were 2-in-1 shampoo. So on the one hand, it was like this, restorative justice idea. So let's say I do something bad to you and you're offended by it, and you say, look, let's make amends. Let's have it mediated by this specialist tribunal, which can kind of get us to kind of reach an agreement and we can both live with each other. Like that seems like a good thing. But what it's turned into is this, inquisitorial process where everybody lawyers up. That cases can drag on for years. They can get very, very expensive, and then there's all the social shame attached to it. So instead of sort of like privately helping people mediate an internal conflict, it becomes like a massive kind of akin to a criminal trial. And you might think that that's not really what was envisioned by the act, but it's how it's playing out.
Wow. Well, before we go any further, I just want to address these side chats. We've got about 400 people watching at the moment. Please remember to put your questions to Mark in the side chat, and I will put those to Mark later. And please remember to subscribe to Loving Life on YouTube and to register on our new lovinglifetv.com platform, where we're transitioning to. It's going to be the widest internet platform for news in South Africa. We've got some really exciting things happening there. And we look forward to you joining us on lovinglifetv.com. Now, I just want to get back to what you were talking about there when it comes to what's happening in the world today. And I'm not just talking about South Africa. I'm thinking of that book, Black Beauty, a wonderfully written book about a horse which was banned. I'm talking about Dr. Seuss, where there now several of his books have been taken off Amazon because they offend people in America. And big ears. I used to I grew up with big ears, and that's banned now because of one of the characters in that book. It has become so politically correct, and what they're doing here is they're just putting another layer on the onion of this whole thing. And the big issue in South Africa, surely, Mark, is the court system. The court system in South Africa is so overwhelmed already. There's something like 1 million fines that have been handed out during the lockdown period for people who have done the wrong thing under the regulations. How the heck is the court system going to cope with this on top of everything else they're not coping with?
Yeah, it is a concern, and I think there is a view in our law that you don't want to let the floodgates of litigation open because it'll drown out your justice system, and we have a constitutional right to access to courts. So if you've got like a flurry of frivolous litigation, that's bad for the whole system. I will say that South African courts have done quite an amazing job during this time. That especially in Johannesburg, there was a move very quickly to have digitized court proceedings, so that all the documents, instead of having to go to court with physical records, could be placed online in a central server that was secure, that our hearings are generally done over Microsoft Teams or over Zoom, that the judges have really come to the party to ensure that cases are heard, and that is quite phenomenal. And also, we've been quite good at entertaining challenges to the lockdown rules. There were a number of rules which I think were serious infringement of people's rights, and I think you had rules like that all around the world, but South Africans were quite good at stepping up and challenging that. Successful.
We just had a slight bit of audio issue there for a second, but I think it's passed, hopefully. Now, what about making people vicariously liable for contraventions of the Act performed by the workers, employers, or agents? I know you've touched on this, but I'd like you to expand on that and give a couple of examples of the impact on that on the business. And of course, this could include discrimination, hate speech, and harassment, couldn't it?
Yes, it does. Well, the other thing to bear in mind is the sanctions. So you've got a situation, as I say, where your employee has performed, one of these contraventions of the Act. But the kinds of things that you can do to the company, there's the paying of damages, there's the legal fees attached to it, but you can also take away someone's license. And that license could be, imagine that you're a broadcasting authority or something, and you have the license to do this, or imagine, let's say, a restaurant license or a liquor license or those sorts of things. Again, the worry with that, as you've pointed out, is the kind of competition angle. So your competitors say, well, let's lay some complaints against these guys. We can have their licenses removed if we're successful, and that'll help us flourish in business. So that's a concern. It also, could have very severe implications for a business where your employee does something that you had no control over, and now it means that you can no longer operate your business because your license has been taken away. So, yeah, very much a concern. The ramifications would be quite serious.
Right. Now, surely this is going to be a huge deterrent for foreign investors in South Africa, this on top of everything else.
Yeah, it might have those repercussions. So you might think, as an overseas company, do I really want to invest in South Africa under conditions when I can be held liable in this draconian fashion?
And the negative media coverage I'll get.
Yes, sure, exactly. In other words, if it's, ex-foreign company hauled before equality court, doesn't play very well on the press. So, you could have those concerns. And yeah, I mean, there's a sense in which South Africa has really made itself an environment which is not business friendly and not very friendly towards international investment. I mean, obviously, we've sort of touched on the sort of expropriation without compensation moves. I mean, that's one way to successfully annihilate your economy. I mean, I thought it was one of those things that was totally and utterly unconscionable to have done before COVID. But now, given what the government has done to, to the economy because of the lockdown rules, some of which might have been, good ideas, but many of which were overly draconian and have led to millions of jobs being shed, to now try and destabilize property rights under those conditions, is just beyond the pale.
Right. Now, I just want to get back to this liability question, which we were just touching on. And the new offence, as I understand it, under this act is if you retaliate or threaten to retaliate against a person who objects to a discriminatory act, you can actually go to court as well. And not only that, any person who causes or encourages or requests another person to discriminate against another person is deemed to have discriminated against such other person. Now, surely this is all hearsay. This is incredibly complicated. Aren't they just making a absolute shit fight for themselves by doing this sort of stuff in this act?
Yeah, I mean, you might think some of it has some noble intent, and my feeling when you're trying to read legislation is you must think about, how could this be used for pernicious means? And that retaliation stuff is complicated because you can imagine someone comes to you and they try and extort you. So they say, look, I'm going to lay a complaint against you for this thing that you did or said or refrained from doing in my workplace.
Unless you pay me X amount.
Yes, or give me whatever other benefit it is. And you say, listen, you better not do that. That would be an abuse. They can say, oh, you're retaliating against me because you're resisting my claim. So you can sort of tie someone up in a knot. And so that's a concern.
Wow.
And then this sort of question about encouraging someone, again, because we've distorted the term discriminate, and it doesn't bear its ordinary meaning, you could be encouraging someone to do something that we wouldn't ordinarily think of as discrimination, but under the act is discrimination. So again, it's sort of just widening the pool of people that you can hold liable.
Now, what we're saying, in effect, is it comes down to something as basic as if someone smiles at you and you don't smile back. They could say, oh, that's an act of discrimination because you didn't smile back.
It's a good case. I think it's also a case that could double bind you. So let's say you smile at someone and they say, I feel like that was quite a leery smile. And I think you were discriminating against me on the grounds of sex. Or as you say, you didn't smile at me. You just had this blank look. And I think that's because I'm a woman. And you don't think that I'm worthy of a smile. So you have this double bind because it's acts and omissions and the intent isn't there. And really what matters is how the person feels about it. I'll give you another kind of interesting example. So in the States, the Federal Drug Administration is looking at having a ban on menthol cigarettes. Okay, now I'm not a smoker. I have no particular attachment to smoking. But their argument for why they want to ban it is that they say it has a disproportionate impact on African Americans. Okay, so they say, more African Americans smoke menthol cigarettes than other people. Therefore, they're likely to, get all the health hazards that are attached to smoking. And so therefore, we are going to ban these cigarettes for their benefit. Okay. Now, Al Sharpton, who's a very well-known civil rights, let's say, activist in the States, has said, if you ban menthol cigarettes, that will be discriminatory against the African American community because we really value those cigarettes. They're loved by the community. They are used by us disproportionately. And if you banned it, what it would do is it would lead to people selling these cigarettes illegally, which would have more confrontations with the police and would lead to, a loss of lives in those confrontations. So therefore, banning is discriminatory. So now I have a situation where banning it and not banning it is discriminatory on the grounds of race. And whatever you do, you're caught in the net. And so our legislation is sort of leading us down that path where whatever you do, whatever you refrain from doing, you're caught. Because we've removed intention and we've made it acts and omissions. So, as I said, we could dream up so many examples where someone's liable, and that's a serious problem. When people are constantly walking on eggshells, not sure what they can do and what they can't do, it's not good for the populace.
And of course, it just gives the fake mainstream media another reason for not reporting the truth. Um,
Yeah, they might become terrified. In other words, the chilling effect on them becomes very severe. They think if we say this, are we going to offend someone? And we don't want to, get hauled before the Equality Court. We don't want our license taken away from us. We don't want to be, mulked in legal costs or huge damages. Let's just not say anything. It's safer that way. And of course, one of the things you've got to recognize about why free speech matters so much is if you care about truth, you want people to be able to say things. That might ruffle other people's feathers,
Yeah.
Because they might turn out to be true. So if we think about a kind of recent example, the social media giants have played quite a big role during the pandemic in censoring speech.
Exactly.
And they've sort of said, well, if you say something false about COVID, we're gonna censor it. And so one of the things that had been removed for a long time was anyone who made the claim that there was a lab leak in Wuhan, that speech was censored. And now there's been a reversal because the viewers, well, maybe it's a genuine possibility. And if it's a genuine possibility, it's something that you want to be able to investigate and you want to find out what's actually true. And so the cost of the censorship is that for a long time, you couldn't determine, the source of COVID. Might have had huge impacts on how you treat it. Similar things with regards to certain drugs. So you might think, for example, there were certain drugs that Donald Trump said were a great idea. People hate Donald Trump, so they said, well, we need to come out hard against any of these drugs, which is a bizarre way of thinking about science. When you start politicizing the science, you miss out on the truth. And so, lives are going to be lost. They're going to be cost to that. And so you want a system in which people are able to say things that may turn out to be false. But one of the ways we work out if they're false is we clash the swords. We interrogate the evidence and we try and find out what's actually true.
Yeah. Well, I have to tell you that I had 2 YouTube channels taken down in the last year for community strikes. And as a result of medical misinformation, which involved the origins of the coronavirus. And now that they've actually had a turnaround and they're now allowing those sort of comments and discussions, they haven't retracted those community strikes and they haven't put those channels back up again. They're permanently gone. But thankfully, we've got all those videos archived on the cloud, and they'll be actually searchable on our new platform on lovinglifetv.com. And that is the only reason that we're actually setting up our own platform, is to get away from the censorship of big tech, because it's become totally obscene.
Yeah, and the concern with that, if YouTube really was the kind of marketplace, which I think it was for a long time, where you could be exposed to a variety of different views and you have all people there, you don't have this kind of polarization problem that you could have with people being driven into other avenues. So instead of someone being able to be checked by someone with a contrary opinion because YouTube has this variety of viewers, you then wind up getting pushed into an echo chamber where your ideas aren't under scrutiny, and that can be a bad thing. And so, there's a danger in driving content underground, because some of the content that gets driven underground might be the kind of thing that you want to be aware of. So, if people hold, let's say, very vile views, so my grandparents fled Nazi Germany to escape the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And I think if you deny the Holocaust existed, you're doing something quite hateful. But I also think you have the right to do it, because I want to know how many people are out there that deny the Holocaust. I want to get a sense of how big the problem is, because it gives us a sense of how much more time and energy needs to be spent on educating people about that. But if you ban it, then it gets driven into these sort of echo chamber spaces, and now I have no idea. Now I have no idea how much of a problem it is, and that sort of movement can grow silently until it becomes a genuine problem.
Well, I'll tell you the irony of what's happening on big tech, okay? In fact, I put a story up about this on lovinglifetv.com and not on YouTube, because if I'd put it up on YouTube, it would have got a community strike and been taken down. And the story is about a fellow by the name of Brett Weinstein, who used to work at a university. He's got a PhD, strong supporter of Bernie Sanders. He has got 2 community strikes in the last week for saying things about ivermectin that YouTube disagree with. And the irony here is that when this censorship first started, YouTube were only targeting people on the right. And now they're starting to target people on the left. And now they're screaming out like, stuck pigs. But while they were only targeting people on the right, they just laughed and said, no, that's cool, that's good. But now the shoe's on the other foot. They're not so happy about the situation. But that is what is going on out there. The censorship by big tech is just extraordinary. Now let's get back to what we're talking about here, which is the Equality Act. What are the penalties courts can dish out to people or companies under the amended act? Do we know how many millions of rands they can actually dish out as fines, or what other things can they put people behind bars? What are the various things courts can do?
Well, so if you've got to again look at the original Equality Act, which sets out the different powers the courts have, so those are unchanged, but obviously the nature of the offences has shifted, so more people can be punished. So the equality courts can't give you direct imprisonment, but they can refer your case to the national prosecuting authorities to investigate whether you've committed another kind of crime. So there's the new cybercrimes bill, for example, which is now an act. So you could have done something that's a breach of the Equality Act and also a breach of that act, or of the Rise Assemblies Act, for example, or criminal injuria. So you could have a situation where the Equality Court says you need to be further investigated, and it could ultimately lead to your jail time, but it would be in terms of actual criminal legislation. And of course, as I say, the other thing that you could be done is to require you to make an apology, which is an interesting thing. I mean, you might think that apologies are an important resource under conditions where someone is actually sorry, and that it will be useful for restoring relationships. But there's a concern that apologies don't mean what they used to mean. And I think there's a concern with, if you force someone to make an apology, it's not clear how sincere it is. And I think people care about sincere apologies. There are some cases that I've seen where it has been quite useful to have an apology. So you might be aware of, there was a guy in Nsebo Dlamini, who was one of the SRC leaders at Wits, and had described himself as a friend of Hitler, and had said all sorts of ludicrous things over the years. He'd pretended that he was related to Walter Sisulu. He, said that he had a secret nuclear physics degree, and had said quite a lot of anti-Semitic stuff over the years as well. And the South African Board of Jewish Deputies thought, well, you can take two approaches with these things. You can take someone to an equality court, and you can put them through this process, or you can engage in a kind of restorative justice process where you try and get the person to understand, the error of their ways.
Right.
And that's the approach that they took with him. And they said, look, come to the Holocaust and Genocide Center, come get a sense of what happened during the Holocaust, come see the parallels that have happened with other genocides subsequent to that. We want you to just understand what it is you're saying. And he then later wrote quite a viewed as quite a sincere apology, basically sort of saying like he realizes what he said was wrong, it was insensitive, it was anti-Semitic, he's learnt much more since then. And that's quite useful to have someone who's kind of reformed themselves. There was another case of a guy who had said he wanted to get a bazooka so that he could blow up Afrikaners. And he was required to perform some community service, which he did in white squatter camps. And he'd come from quite a wealthy background himself, and he said it completely and utterly changed his view on race relations. He said, like, he sort of always assumed that all white people are very wealthy and living these privileged lifestyles, and he sort of said he'd never seen such poverty and suffering, and very much the scales fell from his eyes, and he denounced in quite strong terms what he'd done in the past. So there are measures that can be quite useful. But the concern, as I say, is that you don't want these things abused for pernicious reasons.
Yeah. Well, just for the people watching who aren't in South Africa, it's estimated now that 750,000 whites are living in squatter camps, which is about roughly 20% of the white population, which is an extraordinary number. So if you think that they're the privileged class, think again. And a large number of other whites are battling and just hanging on before they have to move into squatter camps. It's absolutely appalling. And that's largely as a direct result of these racist employment laws that the ANC government have brought in, and including black economic empowerment. We'll touch on that a bit later. But let's get back to the Equality Act. And before we do, one other thing I want to touch on is that I'm blown away that defamation in South Africa is a criminal charge. Here in Australia, it's a civil charge. And I think around the world elsewhere, it's just a civil charge where one party takes the other party to court. And if they're shown to have defamed someone, then they have to pay X amount of money. But in South Africa, you can actually go behind bars for defaming someone, can't you?
Yes, it is quite unique. So criminal defamation has basically been sort of seen as unconstitutional in most countries. We've retained it. So we still have civil defamation, as you say, between two parties, but you can be prosecuted for it. And what's interesting is that, look, it's very, very rare for it to happen. But there's a case where someone who was a parliamentarian produced a pamphlet about other political parties. And, it's the kind of speech that you really want to be protecting. And even if it turns out to have been false speech, you want people to be critical of political parties and have some room for it. And he was prosecuted and ultimately held liable. And he argued before the Supreme Court of Appeal that it was an unconstitutional law, and the Supreme Court of Appeal upheld it. It was quite a long time ago, but it was post-Constitution. It'd be interesting to see if we have further challenges to something like that. But yeah, it's very much seen as the kind of law that's used by totalitarians and dictators, and in most civilized countries they don't have criminal defamation.
It's the sort of thing you'd expect Putin to do, but
yeah.
Let's move on with the Equality Act. It includes a series of hefty obligations that are placed on non-government organizations, traditional leaders and institutions, community organizations, and those contracting with the state. And the executive will be empowered to create codes to regulate those sectors. Without any hint of irony, government ministers will be empowered to discriminate between people, companies, and organizations depending on their size, resources, and influence. Do you want to talk to that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting section. So when this bill was first advertised, no mention was made of this, and it's kind of buried, towards the end of the amendment. And I think it's probably one of the most dangerous parts. So really what it does is just provide the state with this enormous power to regulate NGOs. Now, as we've sort of throughout our discussion, we've talked about how civil society has played this really fantastic role in, pushing back against some of the more draconian measures taken by the state. And I think, South Africans can be hell of a proud about this, that we, I think, do more than most to sort of, fight for people's rights and fight for their freedoms as, civil society organizations. And I think the state knows that, and they are desperate to try and clip civil society's wings. And this is that kind of backdoor approach, which is basically to empower the state to create codes. So you could then have, particular regulations which create obligations on those NGOs. And as you point out, they can be tailor-made. So you can have a code just for certain organizations, just for one of those organizations. So they can say, well, you're of a certain size or of a certain influence, or, you have these resources and we have a code for you. And we're going to make it very difficult for you to operate. And you can also place, as I say, they have these obligations to promote equality and eliminate discrimination. But because the meaning of those words has been distorted, it could create all sorts of funny obligations. And as you've hinted at earlier, with the BE codes and the state's obsession with, demographic representativity, you could have a situation where those codes say, well, you have to hire people that mirror the demographics of the country. So you could imagine, let's say, that you're an organization that promotes Venda as a language. And they say, well, Venda speakers are obviously a minority in South Africa. You need to hire more Zulus and more Afrikaners. And if you don't, we're going to close you down. So it could be used as a way of silencing these organizations or making it impossible for them to operate, and requiring them to do things that are antithetical to their views. So, if you're the Free Market Foundation, for example, and you care about, free enterprise, you'd now suddenly be required to promote this new distorted version of equality, which is highly redistributive. It's about equality of outcomes, not about, equality before the law. It's about making sure everyone has the same stuff. And so that's going to be antithetical to, kind of free market foundations, libertarian instincts, which are about saying, well, everyone must get a fair go at things, but they're going to be winners and losers in a marketplace, and you can't constantly be redivvying up all your resources. So yeah, I think that's something that people should be quite concerned about.
Well, I was speaking to a guy just 6 hours ago. We had a live stream. I was invited to talk to this organization online, and he brought up the point that he was actually heading up a very big contract on Kasili, the power station, one of the Eskom power stations. And he said one of the most complicated areas was that to comply with BEE, they had to have so many black staff, okay, which was okay. They'd have so many colored staff, they'd have so many Indian staff, and then very few white staff, which made getting the skills for those positions very difficult because the skills they needed tended to be amongst the white staff. But he said the really tricky side was to get around that. They actually had to send out tenders to BEE compliant companies. And of course, what you had was the senior managers in the know at Eskom would contact their wives or their sisters or whatever, who would set up this little shelf company. They would get the contract, and then they would employ the white person who should have got that job in the first place, but because they were going through the black tenderpreneur, who was an African lady, it then filled the slot to make them compliant with BEE. It's a complete and utter farcical situation, isn't it?
Yes, so I've been involved in some litigation on this front for the Rule of Law Project. There's a constitutional court case, which is Sakalika versus the Minister of Finance, on the legality of some of these BEE regulations which were passed by the minister. And so to give you a kind of idea, we have this Preferential Procurement Act, which requires government, when it's doing any procuring for goods and services, to have a points distribution, so that 80% of the points are dealt with on the grounds of price, and 20% of the points are dealt with on BEE status. But there's a further regulation which allows these organs of state which are doing the procuring to cut out certain people from the marketplace. So if you don't have a certain BEE score, or you're not a certain kind of company, you don't have enough black ownership, they can say you can't even compete. Now, what's interesting about this, when we argued that it was unconstitutional, if you go back to the Constitution on procurement, it says there are a number of guiding principles that you have to have. It's got to be a transparent tender process. It's got to be competitive. It's got to be fair. You can take into account preference, but it says that the preference must be about historically disadvantaged individuals. It doesn't actually refer to race. And if you look at the original regulations, what you had was a non-racial approach, which was to say something along these lines, which was, if you were historically disadvantaged in that you were denied the right to vote during apartheid, well, then you could be given a preference under this act. And of course, what that means is that over time, more and more people will have been born frees and will not be historically disadvantaged, and the preferences will fall away. And that's what you kind of want. You want to be able to assist those that did suffer discrimination, but not people that merely look like them. And then over time, this sort of morphed into, instead of looking at historically disadvantaged people, it became about black people. And to give you an idea of what counts as black, one of the documents that was shown to me in some other litigation, where someone had applied, an organ of state had applied for an exemption, and they said, we don't like that the way that the legislation is currently drafted is that black means African, Indian, and colored. We think that Indians and colored should be excluded from this. And we also don't like that it's an 80-20 split. We think it should be a 50-50 split. So we want to be able to allocate more points on the grounds of race. So you kind of get the sense of where these things go, and it's pretty dangerous. So we challenged this and acted as a friend of the court. What's nice about one of the things that's interesting about the pandemic is that these hearings, which would have been in physical courtrooms, are now held online. So if your listeners want to go to the Constitutional Court's site, they can go and watch that whole hearing, and they can see the submission that I made, which is about saying that basically the minister had exceeded his powers and that they'd done something unconstitutional, and that also they'd violated this value of non-racialism, which is caked into our constitution. It's in section 1 of the constitution. So you can't just differentiate on the grounds of race. The constitution doesn't allow it, but it's clearly what's happening on the ground.
Right. Now,
the other thing I thought I'll
yeah,
just point out,
on.
which is just think about these goods and services for a second and think, like, what is this whole thing about? You're trying to help people that are poor and vulnerable. And, surely when it comes to making sure that your electricity grid works, those that are the most poor and vulnerable are, going to be, really subject to the whims of the state, and they're going to be very hard hit, when their lights are turned off. And a lot of them are going to be poor and black. So if you care about just helping an elite few of guys who are, already very wealthy from these BE tenders, yeah, sure, go ahead, run your corrupt system. If you care about poor black South Africans who are on the ground, just make sure that the people running these things are the best and the brightest, regardless of race. Because it has an impact. When you're delivering services, they affect the most vulnerable. And those are the people that you should actually care about, not just, the big guys in business who happen to be of a particular racial group.
Right. No, I've seen in the side chat that my sound is a bit low. So I'm going to talk louder, guys, because I am actually on 100% on my audio, on the streaming and on my computer. So maybe I've just been talking a bit quiet. Tell me if that sounds a bit better as I'm talking now. Okay, so just continuing on with the Equality Act, Mark. In a further move against the ordinary meaning of equality, provision is made for the state funding of legal expenses incurred by those initiating complaints, but not those defending themselves against those complaints, which comes back to that issue we talked about at the very beginning, where you have, let's say, two competing trucking companies in Harrismith, and one tries to undermine the other one using this act, because the one that's been undermined is going to have to pay their own legal costs as well. Do you want to talk to that?
Yeah, so if we think about how legal aid ordinarily works, it's most often used for people in criminal defense. So, we accept that there's a disparity between the state, which has, enormous coffers, and individuals. And so that if they're prosecuted and they're poor, the idea is that you should try and, rectify that problem by giving them a chance at being able to get, legal defense. And so that's paid for by the state under certain circumstances. And here what we have is a reversal of that. So the state's going to fund people laying the complaints, but it's not going to fund those that have to defend those complaints. And I think this is something that really worries me. We've sort of seen it with some things the Human Rights Commission has done, is they'll have a case that's a bad case. They know they can't win, but they know that they can publicly humiliate you, and they know that the costs of you defending it will exceed the damages that you might have to pay. So they threaten you and they say, listen, we're going to lay this complaint against you unless you pay, us X money. And you say, well, I'd have to pay all this money to my lawyers, and I don't want to be, drowning through the coals. So I guess I better just roll over. And so that's very dangerous.
Right. Well, I'm pleased to see most people say my sound is fine. So let's hope that's how it is. Okay. Just continuing on with the Equality Act. It requires the state to overhaul all laws, policies, codes, practices, and structures which do not conform to the newly proposed definitions of equality and discrimination. Now, are those overhauls done by the ministers in the ANC government? How does that work?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a real revolutionary thing. It's saying that, if this thing gets passed, you now have an obligation on all of these ministers to go through all of the underlying laws in South Africa and make sure that they conform to these new definitions of equality and discrimination. Now, that's quite an ask. also something that is, as I say, buried at the bottom of the statute. Think about the costs involved in, trawling through the tens of thousands of pieces of legislation and to say, well, we think that this thing is sort of, somehow inegalitarian. I mean, one of the statements that was made about the cybercrimes bill is that it is the first bill to use non-binary gendered language. And this was sort of, upheld as a wonderful virtue. Now, imagine if you said, well, we think that all legislation needs to, conform to a non-binary use of gender language. So anytime a he or a she is used, well, that's very inegalitarian and it's very offensive to people that are non-binary. We need to overhaul all those statutes. Think about the cost of doing that for basically no gain at all. All those statutes at the beginning basically say something like, whenever he is used, it's inclusive of, he and she. So you kind of get this very minor effect for a huge cost. And then there could be substantive things as well. So, the wording of the bill says that the measures to be adopted by the state to achieve equality must proactively address systemic and multi-dimensional patterns of inequality and discrimination found in social structures, rules, attitudes, actions, or omissions which prevent the full and equal enjoyment of rights and freedoms as contemplated in the Constitution, including equal access to resources, opportunities, benefits, advantages, and social goods. If that doesn't sound like a Marxist utopia to you, then I don't know what could. This is this sort of idea of like, everybody's going to have exactly the same stuff. And we're going to make sure that we can restructure society to meet our wonderful vision of this. Now, they forget that this has been tried a few times, and it's led to the deaths of over 100 million people.
Wow.
Once you think that everybody has to have the same stuff, then you have to start doing things to make sure that people have the same stuff. You have to start taking away from people. You have to start, depriving people of things. There's a short story written by Kurt Vonnegut exactly 50 years ago called Harrison Bergeron. And it opens with the lines, we have finally achieved full equality in the year 2081. And the idea is that what we do is we make sure that everybody is identical. So if you're very smart, what we do is we strap some headphones on you and we blast sounds to interrupt your thoughts. If you're very strong, we make you carry around, heavy sandbags so that you are the same as everybody else. Because wouldn't it be terrible if some people were actually excellent? That we couldn't stomach that in our wonderful egalitarian utopia. And that's where this is heading, is the sense of saying, like, we can't tolerate people that are excellent. They need to be dumbed down. They need to be brought down.
Yeah.
We can't have people that are actually good at what they do. Everybody needs to be equally badly off. And that's the wonderful thing about these societies. If you want to go to a place where everybody is equal, go to Somalia, where everyone is equally badly off. I'd much rather, if I was a poor person, want to live in a place where you have inequalities, but the poor do quite well. You'd much rather be in a place where you say, I've got a good go at it. I've got equality before the law. I'm not going to be discriminated against because of the color of my skin or because of my sex. And if I'm really good, I'm going to prosper. If you're meritorious, you'll do well. That's the kind of society I'd prefer to live in.
Right. Now, I want to give you a hypothetical situation. I went to boarding school in South Africa. I had 8 years at boarding school. I know a lot of the private schools, good private schools in South Africa. And, of course, there's been a large growth in the black students now attending those schools, which is great. That's great. But some of these private schools now, they're actually having organizations established in them based on Black Lives Matter. Now, the reason I'm raising this is because a lot of the students who do post-matric at those high schools are over 18. Now, let's take a hypothetical situation where two seniors or two kids over 18 have a bit of a barmy, okay, during school, and the one student is offended. Legally, under this new Equality Act, what is the liability of the school? Because now you've got this fellow who's over 18 who can legally go and take the school to court, can't he?
Well, I mean, you can have that. It's not even an over 18 thing, of course. Yeah, I mean, you could have, minors can take schools to court, in any event. You can have a guardian that brings litigation on your behalf. So yeah, there would definitely be school liability. I mean, I have a friend who was at one of these elite private schools, and they had a rule at the school about enforcing social distancing. For the benefit of the kids, the idea was, well, kids need to stay, I don't know, 2 meters
6 feet
apart from each
apart.
other so they
Yeah.
don't spread, they don't spread COVID. And so she had been enforcing this rule, throughout, and approached a group of young black girls who were sitting on top of each other, and she said, "Hey guys, there's a rule. You've got to social distance." And so they laid a complaint, and they said, "We think this was racially motivated, and we think you're a racist." And she was driven out of the school.
Wow.
And so you can imagine that, with the introduction of this legislation, that not only would she be liable because they say, well, we felt prejudice through even your neutral application of the rule, that the school itself be liable and could be forced before an equality court to apologize, to pay damages, to sort of do this apology dance. Very, very dangerous.
All right, well, let's take another hypothetical situation. Let's say I'm a member of an organization like a bowls club or something like that. And two of the members have the same thing happen actually at the club, where there's a bit of a disagreement and one takes the other one to court over the Equality Act. What's the liability of that bowls club in this particular action?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I mean, you wouldn't be employees of it. I suppose the question is whether, maybe under those like encouragement things. In other words, if you said, well, the bowls club now has some kind of positive duty to have intervened in our dispute, and that they didn't, that somehow makes them liable. So yeah, those are concerns. I mean, I think, we're definitely going to have these issues regarding, clubs and associations. And I think you're going to have it in religious organizations as well, that you could have a situation where, someone is reading from their favorite religious text and someone else feels prejudiced by what was said. And so, they lay complaints against that imam, that rabbi, that pastor, and against the synagogue, the mosque, or the church.
Wow.
And so I know the organization 4SA, which is about freedom of religion, have highlighted that as an issue in their submission on this legislation.
Right. Now, look, this whole new Equality Act that they're proposing clearly appears to be another plank in the discrimination against the minority white group. That's the way I'm reading it. And when we talk about historically disadvantaged peoples, who actually fits into that category, and how can they benefit from this adaptation of the act to the detriment of other communities?
I'll say a couple of things. So the one is, as I say, on its face, the act is neutral with regards to race. So it mentions race as a group. This legislation doesn't refer to historically disadvantaged, but in practice, it does seem to be the case that some people are prosecuted while others aren't. My view, if you go and look at the Constitution, and it uses that term, historically disadvantaged individuals, I think what you've got to do is be sensitive to reality and say there are certain people that really were disadvantaged during apartheid, and they are deserving of compensation. But that's very, very different to people who look like them. So I think that if you are Cyril Ramaphosa's kid, and you've grown up with, a silver spoon and access to the best schools and the best universities, you are not previously disadvantaged. And it's crazy to treat you as if you were. Justice requires restoring the wrongs of the past for those that actually suffer the wrongs, not merely those that share their melanin levels. I also think, look, on the minority front, so in other words, if you care about protecting minorities, and South Africa really is a nation of minorities. In other words, you've got people of different language groups, of different religions, of different races. There is no genuine majority in South Africa. Then you want to ensure that everyone is free to kind of lead the lives that they want to lead without interference from the state. And I think that's a vital thing to recognize.
Right. Now, public bodies, which include traditional leaders, must set aside funds to eliminate discrimination and promote equality, or explain why no funds were provided. I know, for example, I used the example of the private schools in South Africa. I know that they are now incorporating affirmative action teachings or classes in their curriculum, so that they actually cover this aspect. Now, they've been doing this before this act came about, and it's quite extraordinary, because on one hand you've got what I would call a politically correct narrative being pushed in private schools, because I mean I was at private school, and there were people of color there, and they were treated like anybody else. It's when you actually start drawing attention to this fact, you actually cause the discrimination to come in, because then people start challenging, people of different color, etc., etc. I just find this absolutely self-defeating. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you can very much have a backfire effect. So, I mean, if you think about someone like Ashwin Willemse, the rugby player, he took huge umbrage at the term token player being used to describe black players. Now, I think you should take umbrage at the term like that. In other words, you want to say, I was picked because I'm actually a good rugby player, and that's why I'm here. But if you do have a system where you're putting an emphasis on race as opposed to merit, well, then, of course, you're going to have people that were picked on that basis. You can't have it both ways. You either have to have a situation where you say, everybody here who's on this rugby team is the best, and we pick those that are meritorious, in which case to call someone a token is just, not conforming with what we actually do. Or you have a tokenism system, and then when someone calls you a token, you have to say, yeah, I am. And, that's the way it is. So that's a serious concern, and it undermines the dignity of people. When you have, these kind of race-based affirmative action systems, it's very hard to shuck off the baggage, because you're easily identifiable as someone who warrants this additional leg up, even if you don't actually need it, even if you would have gotten there because you are the best. So yeah, you can very much have that, and then you can have the resentment that builds as well. People sort of say, I didn't get this job because of affirmative action, and they start to resent people of other races, and that's not good for a reconciliation project.
Right. Now, I'm of the view personally, and this is a personal view, that this whole thing, when it comes to this equality bill or act, is a smokescreen to distract people from the blatant corruption taking place at all levels of government. Because what they're trying to do now is lead the media into taking up stories related to or as a result of this new act, instead of stories which should be concentrating on how corrupt the entire government system is. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's something in it. So if you think about, let's kind of wind back time a little bit, and think about when you had, the blatant corruption coming out from the Zuma administration. You had South Africans from all quarters, saying Zuma must fall, and trying to hold him accountable. And this was just after he'd fired our finance minister, and the rand had tanked. 2 weeks after that, this little old lady who lives in the north coast of Natal gets strung up for hate speech charges, Penny Sparrow. No one's ever heard of her before. She's a complete nobody. And that just takes over the press attention, for years to follow.
Yeah.
And, it's Thuli Madonsela at the time had said, this is clearly, an operation that's, she says it's a dead cat tactic. You're having a serious discussion and someone jumps into the room and they take a dead cat and they start swinging it around. Very hard to continue your serious discussion, And she said this was clearly the kind of thing that Bell Pottinger were doing to sort of, pick a certain political agenda to distract the press. And it's the sad thing is doing these kind of things just works so well, because, it's quite depressing to sort of think about, like, South Africa's economy and think about corruption, and it's quite abstract and complicated. These sort of race-baited stories where we can latch onto it and people get really, really strong feelings about it, and it's easy to talk about it because we have, simple terms for this person did something really bad and racist. And so we stop talking about the stuff that matters. So yeah, there is a sense in which it does play into that agenda, and it's dangerous.
Yeah, well, labeling is such a terrible thing. It's so, look, it's a terrible thing. And I think of poor Vicky Momberg, and I think of that white judge. I can't think of her name right now, but she was actually involved in a court action against Julius Malema over his taxes, and she was called a racist.
Mabel Jansen.
Sorry?
Judge Mabel Jansen.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's it. I've actually had quite a few discussions with her, and she's in a position now where she's pretty well going to have to land up in a squatter camp soon, and this is a highly qualified judge, and as a result of the media noise, basically the other judges said, hey, we're going to have to get you to step aside. And it was all because she was taking on Julius Malema. And what a lot of people don't realize is that at this very time, there was an organized break-in of her home. And CCTV cameras showed that these guys were wearing military uniforms. They had AK-47s or R4s. And they broke into her house. And you know what they stole? Her computers and all the documents. And this is all to do with Julius Malema. This is what's happening behind the scenes in South Africa.
Yeah, it's a good thing that you mention it, because so basically the underlying issue, she'd sat as a judge in a series of she'd sat as a judge in a series of cases where there'd been the rape of minors, and she wanted to reach out to someone who had expertise in this area, because she said, you're sitting day in and day out and hearing about this horrible stuff happening, and she thought, what about the poor kids? Is there a sort of place for them where they could be could be assisted? And the person she corresponded with was probably the worst person to talk to, Julian Schutte, and
she's an EFF member.
Yeah, so her and Gillian have these private Facebook messages where the judge sort of details the stuff that she's seen.
Yeah.
It's described in some kind of racist way, which, if we read the messages, clearly not. And Gillian sat on them for a year. And as you say, suddenly Judge Jansen is sitting in Malema's tax case, and then this stuff comes to light. And then she has to, and then she basically ceases to become a judge. And I don't think anything has happened with Malema's tax issues.
No, it was
now
wrong.
That should really concern us. In other words, if you're using tactics to basically get judges removed, for the benefit of politicians that are part of dangerous organizations, that's a worry.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I want to wrap up the live stream. We've been going for about 75 minutes. I just want to wrap up with your comments on a couple of things. Firstly, on Saturday, or was it Sunday? I think it was Saturday. They had this protest in Cape Town about this new gun legislation where self-defense is no longer a reason for having or owning a gun or getting a gun license. And of course, people, including the police, are appalled at this thought. In fact, that came out in the protests. The police were actually saying, we agree, this legislation is bullshit. Do you think that the ANC government are basically leading, and most people who've got legal guns, I'm not talking about the illegal guns, I'm talking about legal, registered guns, are the white community. They're trying to be law upholding people. Now, do you think that the stripping of their guns is, look what happened in Russia, look what happened in Germany, they took the guns away before the genocides happened. Do you think that this is just one step further on what Ramaphosa calls boiling the frog slowly?
Look, I think there is that concern. I think taking away private citizens' guns, has often been done in places where, you have a totalitarian regime that arises. But I want to say this, which is that there are many black gun owners who have legal guns, and their guns will be taken from them as well. So if you think about someone like Big Daddy Liberty, he believes it's important that you have a right to bear arms and protect yourself and your family. And so legislation like this, would strip him of his gun rights as well. I think it's the same thing with expropriation without compensation. People think that it'll just be about taking white people's land. It'll be about taking everybody's land. And if you take away their guns, then they can't defend themselves against the state. So I think it's about rendering citizens as serfs. It's about putting them in a situation where they have no choice but to comply with the state or to kind of be at its bequest, because they have no power. And so I think taking away their guns, is part of that.
Right.
By the way, as far as I understand, very few crimes that are committed with guns are committed by with guns that are legally owned.
Exactly.
The sort of the old line that if you outlaw guns, only outlaws will have guns. You might think that it's a bad thing that there are gun deaths, but it's not clear that banning them will ameliorate that situation.
Right. Now, one final question or one area I'd like you to just talk to, and that is the cybercrimes bill and the implications on free speech, in particular on alternative social media, because I think that's where a lot of truths come out. A lot of whistleblowers actually come out and expose things. And the cybercrimes bill seems to be a bill aimed at actually stemming the tide of information that's coming through from people who are putting senior ANC members at risk through their corruption.
I think that might have been a concern with earlier drafts of the legislation. There definitely been some concerns that it was going to be a big restriction on free speech. I think this might be a situation where we think that some of the lobbying that occurred was able to take away some of the more pernicious aspects of the bill, and so that the act that's come out, from what I've read, some of the restrictions on speech might be reasonable restrictions. So, for example, one of the crimes is a data message which incites damage to property or violence. So it says any person who discloses by means of an electronic communication service a data message to a person, group, or group of persons in the public with the intention to incite the causing of any damage to property belonging to any person or group, or violence against any person or group is guilty of an offence. So that sort of meets our constitutional standard, that it's these calls to action where you're inciting people to go and perform acts of violence or destroy someone's property. I mean, that actually is the kind of thing that could be used to prosecute the EFF, considering their various calls to invade land or drive whites into the ocean. And so, I think I was quite surprised that the crimes they put in for restricting speech really do accord with the Constitution. And I think that's, there are some kinds of speech that are genuinely dangerous. If you call for a hit on someone, that's the kind of speech you might want to restrict. There were concerns in prior drafts that I'd seen which would have had licensing requirements. So people who were publishing on YouTube or publishing on Facebook would have had to have gotten some kind of approval from the Film Publications Board. That, as far as I can tell, is not in the Act. And again, that's through civil society sort of pointing out, hey, there's some dangers here. And that's something I have to say about South Africa, is that because civil society, pays attention, because we still have, a free-ish press, although I think that is changing, some of the pernicious things in legislation can be uncovered. Also, you have an organization like Dear South Africa.
I was about to say Dear South Africa, yeah. They're very good.
I mean, they're really doing just unbelievable work, because you're getting people from all sides of society to kind of look at the law, engage with it, put in their submissions. I think that's played an enormous role in ensuring that the legislation isn't as draconian as it could be. Similar things. If you looked at the old hate speech bill, the original versions of that were completely and utterly unconstitutional, and through quite a lot of lobbying, eventually the bill was scrapped. And so it's important that people realize that their voices still can be heard. They can still push back. One of the underlying policies of the ANC is what they call the balance of forces, which is that, you move towards a national democratic revolution where you have, a kind of communist state where the cadres have total control. But if you get pushback, then you slow down. And thankfully there are organizations who are willing to push back and stop that from happening. But they need to kind of keep doing it, because there's a continual ramping up from the ANC to deprive us of our rights.
Well, I have to say, AfroForum is doing a fantastic job when it comes to that, and I know that you're counsel for AfroForum. And I just want to ask you to just talk to people about the importance of getting submissions in by the 30th of June this year, which is the end date. Do you want to talk to people about that and what they should be saying to the government and how they can actually submit things?
Yeah, so I would recommend reading through the bill, and so we've sort of discussed some of the serious problems with it. People are given an opportunity to put in submissions until the 30th of June and have their voices heard and raise their concerns. So yeah, I think that's a vital thing to do. As I say, South Africans we are quite a civilly aware nation, and we don't like dangerous authoritarian regimes stripping us of our rights. Fighting back against that's important. So I would suggest those that are concerned about what we've talked about today, actually go and do something and, put in a submission. You can do it through Dear South Africa's site. They're not a petition organization. They basically allow people to put in their own personal submission. And that's one way to sort of, push back the tide.
Yeah, clog the system. Now, what's Dear SA's website? Is it dearsa.org.za?
Yes, I know there was a change in the site recently, but I think if you do a Google search for Dear SA, you should come up with the correct one.
Yeah, Dear South Africa or Dear SA, and then go and have a look at the site there. Well, look, I want to thank you, Mark, for the fantastic job that you guys do at AfriForum. The Loving Life channel has always been a big supporter of your work, and we've had quite a few people from AfriForum join us now. I think this is the second time we've had you on tonight, and thank you so much. Is there anything you'd like to say to people? We've got about 400 people watching at the moment. Is there anything you'd like to say to people who are watching now or who might follow this later regarding the Equality Act and its implications and why they should actually put in a submission?
Yeah, so I'd say what's worth doing is trying to read other people's submissions. So AfriForum submission will become available. ForSA also running a submission process in which people can look at their submissions. I'd say, you don't want to outsource your thinking to others. You want to do it yourself. But there are many civil rights society organizations that are, alerting the public to these concerns. And I think, it's worth engaging on it and having your voice heard.
Fantastic. All right, Mark, thank you once again for joining us, and have a great evening, and we'll catch up soon, and take care.
Absolute pleasure.
All right, guys, there you go. That was Mark Oppenheimer, and it's always a wonderful pleasure talking to Mark, because he's such a knowledgeable fellow, and he does fantastic work with AfriForum. I will keep the live stream or the side chat open for a few minutes so you can say your goodbyes or have a bit of a chat. Please remember to register on lovinglifetv.com, our new platform. We actually have already something like 17 contributing channels. These are YouTube channels talking about South Africa, who now have all their videos by their approval running through lovinglifetv.com. We have a forum. I see Nat Quinn is here. Nat runs our forum on lovinglifetv.com. There's a huge amount of news and information and videos through our contributing channels, not just the Loving Life videos, that just give it such a focus on what is going on in South Africa. So I encourage you all to register on lovinglifetv.com. And I'd make this last point, and that is that the reason we set up lovinglifetv.com is because of the blatant censorship that's taking place on YouTube. And as I mentioned earlier in this live stream, I've had 2 Loving Life channels taken down by YouTube over community strikes for medical misinformation, which later those decisions would have been revoked, because now they're allowing people to say that because it's proven to be true, what I said at the time. But that forced us to set up our own independent platform, which is what we're doing. And we intend to make this the biggest news source in South Africa. So please go to lovinglifetv.com, register there, and be part of the community, the Loving Life community. All right, guys, take care and have a great evening. And remember, most nights at 8 p.m. Johannesburg time, we have live streams. Bye for now.